All right, welcome everyone to Moving PE Forward in Illinois, Tips for Engaging in Advocacy, and I'll turn it over to Janice Simon to get us started.
Hi everyone, this is Janice Simon. I'm a program director here at the Illinois Public Health Institute. Welcome. Today's webinar is called Moving PE Forward in Illinois, Tips for Engaging in Advocacy. And we are the Illinois Public Health Institute, a nonprofit in Illinois working to improve health systems, to improve health and equity across the state. And we've been doing PE work for several years now, and today's webinar will teach you a little bit more about what's upcoming in some of our PE campaigns and how you can get involved. So we're excited to have you join us. Next slide, please. So for the next slide, just some logistics to get started. On the right-hand side of your computer, there's the audio and panel controls. So you'll see here you can type into the chat box with questions. You can mute. You can raise your hand to ask a question. Probably questions are best handled in the chat box, however. And then if you need anything, please go ahead and chat in or email us at the email listed there, and we'll get back to you. And then next slide, please. So today we have Sarah Chusid and myself as moderators for today's webinar. So we will both be presenting on some content, and we'll also have a guest speaker that we'll introduce midway through, Alan Madison. He's with Treister, Ross, Scheidler, and Gold, and he's an attorney who will talk to us a little bit more about the lines between lobbying and non-lobbying. Next slide, please. So the webinar's objectives today, we want to increase awareness of PE policy best practice, so best practices in physical education policies and in both schools and state level work. We want to increase understanding of Illinois' legislative process and opportunities to engage in that process. And we want to increase knowledge of effective messages for talking to leaders about PE best practices. So to start the webinar, we'd love to hear from all of you to use the chat box and help us think about, what does high quality PE mean to you? Is it about the amount of time, the type of instruction, if kids are having fun, what kids are learning? Take a minute to type into the chat box and let us know, what does high quality PE mean to you? So we'll wait for you all to finish typing. And I don't think I can see the responses. So maybe Sarah, if you want to highlight what some of the folks are saying, that would be great.
Sure, we have one response coming in: standards-based curriculum, instruction, and assessments. And if anyone else has something I'd like to say, feel free to chime in. You can use the question box or the chat box. We're looking at both. All right, just heard another response. Again, standard and evidence-based curriculum and instruction.
Great. Well, thank you for your input on what high quality PE is. And I'm going to actually turn it over to Sarah now to talk a little bit about our campaign and where we've been and where we're planning on going. So Sarah, go ahead.
Thank you, Jana. So you can see here on the slide, we wanted to discuss a little bit the difference between physical activity and physical education. So as you can see here, physical activity is the movement of body that expends energy, while physical education is the planned, sequential, and developmentally appropriate K-12 curriculum that provides cognitive content and learning experiences, and it uses physical activity as a teaching tool. Physical activity is the vehicle to becoming physically educated, just as a book is a vehicle to becoming a reader. However, just as reading skills require teacher instruction beyond the mere presence of books, to become physically educated, students must be taught knowledge, skills, and attitudes to develop lifelong skills for enhancing fitness and health. So a little bit more, what does high quality enhanced physical education? So our goal is to make sure that all Illinois students have access to high quality enhanced physical education. And we'll get a little, so it's characterized by standards-based instruction and assessment, engaging students in moderate to vigorous physical activity for at least 50% of class time, following appropriate instruction practices. It is developmentally appropriate to students' physical, cognitive, and social needs, and it also provides skill development opportunities, fitness for life. A little bit more on the return on investment that's associated with enhanced PE programs. So you can see here on the slide, there's this growing body of neuroscience research that is showing that for schools that are implementing enhanced PE programs, they are seeing improvements in test scores, academic achievement, and in-class behavior. A little bit more on the background with high-quality PE in Illinois. So the chronic disease rates here in the state, combined with the return on investment that are associated with enhanced PE programs, convinced a delegation of representatives from the Illinois Public Health Institute, the Illinois State Board of Education, the Illinois Department of Public Health, and others to decide to promote enhanced PE in Illinois beginning in 2012. As a result of that, a voluntary task force was formed, and they developed the Enhanced PE Strategic Plan, which is our roadmap to bring high-quality enhanced PE programming to all Illinois students. And from there, a multi-year sequential advocacy effort resulted in the following. This became effective in 2015-16 school year. We revised our state learning standards on physical development and health to move us toward an enhanced PE approach. They now integrate that neuroscience and the connection between movement and improved student outcomes. There's less emphasis on sports and competition and more on teamwork and cooperation, and that emphasis on the development of skills for lifelong health and fitness. And we also have a new law, which is requiring fitness testing for all K-12 students to help them achieve and maintain a health-enhancing level of physical fitness based on continuous self-assessment. And that became effective in the 2016-17 school year. And the daily minutes per week advocacy, we'll get more into that now. So previously, the Illinois PE policies, we had a long-standing daily PE requirement here in the state. And there were individual exemptions for PE. They were allowed for varsity athletes, ROTC, marching band for grades 11 and 12. And there was a 2-year district waivers for PE, renewable for a total of 6 years. So there have been some recent changes. So in August 2017, as part of the bipartisan school funding reform, that PE requirement was changed to a minimum of 3 days per week instead of the daily PE requirement. PE waivers were also lengthened to 5 years, and there's no cap on those. And individual exemptions were expanded from grades just 11 and 12 to encompass grades 7 through 12. So the state board wrote rules around implementation for those. And then in 2018, the Illinois House and Senate approved SB 2572, and that was requiring 150 minutes per week of PE in schools. But that was vetoed by former Governor Rauner. So our goal now as a coalition, and on our PE campaign that we'll be talking about, is to move the state toward the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and Shape America's recommendation for providing 150 minutes per week in elementary schools and 225 minutes per week of PE in secondary schools. So now we want to do a little poll, and we'll hear from you. So the question is up there on the screen, but we want to hear, have you engaged in the Illinois Alliance to Prevent Obesity's PE policy campaigns in the past? So your choices would be yes, you've helped on one of the state PE task forces, updated the standards, yes, helped to advocate for strong PE policy, yes, improved policies in your school or class, or attended a pump-up PE training, yes, educating communities or the media about PE, or no, you're new to this work. So I'm going to go ahead and launch our poll. And in 1 second, you're going to see that on the screen. You can go ahead and put in your responses. We'd love to hear from everyone, so I'm monitoring here, going to leave it open a few seconds. We've had 30% of you vote. We'd love to hear from a bit more, get that a bit higher before we close it out. We'll give you a moment to put your responses in. About 5 more seconds to vote. All right, so with that, I'm going to close our poll, and I'm going to share the results for you, and you're going to see them on the screen here. So it looks like we have 40% that have helped to advocate for strong PE policies. 20% of you have served on the state task forces or worked with updating the standards. 20% of you have improved PE practices in your schools, and 20% are new. So a nice mix, and we're glad to see you all here. With that, I'm going to go ahead and hide our poll, and then we will move on. And now with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jana Simon to talk more and give us an introduction to policymaking.
Great, thank you, Sarah. So on today's webinar, we want to talk briefly about the policymaking process to make sure everyone's on the same page about the opportunities to get involved in the coming year in our PE campaign. So if you go to the next slide, when trying to pass legislation to create a minutes per week PE policy, so to move towards that best practice of 225 minutes per week for secondary school and 150 minutes per week for elementary school, it's important to keep in mind a couple of things. So our state senators and representatives were elected to work for us as constituents and to serve, to listen to our concerns. So we know policymakers listen to their constituents. They also listen to other policy experts and special interest groups that claim to represent particular subsets of their constituents. And we know that public policy changes often come at the demand from the public, from the constituents. So really our goal is to increase the number of people who are demanding change for PE, which will make the legislation more likely to pass. We also know that public opinion can be influenced by various messages, especially when they're attached to people's personal values and beliefs. And so we want to work to create a positive public opinion about high quality PE and a minutes per week requirement to help us move the legislation through the legislature. So next slide, please. So what you see here is called Kingdon's agenda setting policy window. So as we build support for a minutes per week campaign, we want to do our best to create a quote unquote policy window of opportunity. So this is described by Kingdon, and we want to make sure that the current PE policy is seen as a problem, so creating that problem, aligning that problem stream. We want to ensure the policy solution we propose is feasible and that the politics are agreeable to our new policy. So when a problem is urgent and seen as an issue and the policy solution is strong and the politics align, just as you see here in the image, our window of opportunity to pass legislation opens up. So we believe with a change in governor and the new administration coming in 2019, and with a supermajority of Democrats in the House and Senate who have historically been friendly to PE, we think the politics are lining up to be favorable for PE in the spring. We need to work together to ensure the current policy is seen as a problem and that the new policy is considered feasible and strong. And so we definitely have in our campaign a way to try to increase that policy feasibility to create all these streams coming together for our window of opportunity. Next slide, please. So here you'll see that policy feasibility is often depends on a few different items, and interest groups or coalitions like ours can do a few things to help increase the chances that legislation will pass. So we can work to ensure that we meet our policy window by increasing the saliency of the issue, and this means really making it a really important public topic, so bringing lots of public attention to it, having people talking about it, having legislators hear from their constituents about it, really making it seem like it's important. And this really means a lot of conversation from constituents and letters from constituents, meetings from constituents for the policymaker to recognize that it's an issue. We also can try to ensure that our discussion of the issue is well-timed. So sometimes, lots of focus may be on one issue and then something happens in the news that moves all of everyone's attention to a new issue. So IAPO partner lobbyists through the Illinois Alliance to Prevent Obesity will be helping to navigate the timing of committee hearings and other deadlines that ensure that PE isn't left to the side if other topics become more timely. So really try to ensure that we're talking about at the right times. And we will continue to work to build political will. So this means educating the new legislators in 2019 about the importance of high quality PE and the benefits of a minutes per week policy, as well as working with all of you to increase political will among our senators and representatives. So really, if we increase saliency, timing, and political will, we're hoping we can move the legislation. Next slide, please. So just a note of what the spring legislative session looks like in 2019. It starts in January and it goes through May 31st. There are some key deadlines for moving legislation through. So the dates noted here are for the Senate. The House sometimes has slightly different dates, but in the Senate, the deadline to get the bill language to what is called the Legislative Reference Bureau is February 1st. So that is when the Legislative Reference Bureau, or LRB, will help draft the bill language into a piece of legislation. The bill introduction, the bill has to be introduced in the Senate by February 15th if it's going to be sort of alive for discussion for this session. And then it must pass out of a Senate committee by March 22nd. So that's just over a month from introduction that we have to help educate legislators about it and move it from out of the committee. And then once it's on out of the committee, it goes to the floor of the Senate or the House. And then once it's voted on there, if it passes, it moves to the other chamber to go through the same process, again, through committees back to the floor for a vote. And if there are any changes to the bill in either the House or the Senate, there's a reconciliation process. And after that, it goes to the governor to be signed, or if nothing is done, it automatically becomes law, or the governor can veto it. So that's the basic process we're looking at for the spring. If you want to go to the next slide. And so what we want to hear from you now, using the chat box, and Sarah, you'll have to help me read what people say. We want to know what kind of ways should advocates in Illinois, what ways can we increase political will, saliency, or improve the timing for passing a minutes per week policy in Illinois, given what you know about legislation? We'd love to hear your ideas for how we can move this forward in the spring. So I'll give everyone a second to write into the chat box to let us know your ideas. And Sarah, if you could please read them, that would be great.
Yes.
We'll give everyone another minute or so to chat in.
All right, we have a couple responses coming in. So target new legislators and help educate them on PE. Oh, lots of responses, great. Address the complications of not having it in the school system. Witness slips, calls, emails, letters, in-home meetings, and meet or send letters to local representatives.
Great, thank you. So if you want to move to the next slide. So just a few ways to engage. If you sign up for our PE action alerts, you were able to do that through your registration process. But if you, for whatever reason, click no when you register and want to sign up anyway, you can contact us and we'll have information at the end. And that will allow you to get timely updates as the legislation moves through, and you can take action if you wish. So you can sign up for action alerts. And if you're representing an organization, your organization can participate in strategy development. There will be regular calls related to this campaign, and we'd love to have more folks involved in developing the strategy, and that can be done at both a non-lobbying level and a lobbying level. So you can let us know that. Certainly sending educational messages out to your own networks via newsletters or social media. Those are all non-lobbying activities that are great ways of educating the public about the PE campaign. You can send grassroots action alerts out to your own networks as well. So if you receive an action alert from the Illinois Public Health Institute, you can forward it on and they can use our system to help contact their legislators, or you can create it through your own grassroots lobbying platform. Also meeting with or calling legislators to discuss the importance of PE. That could be going to their office or inviting them to your gym to watch your PE class. You can talk about the importance of good PE policy in the media or via letters to the editor. So if you see any conversations around health or legislation or around PE, you can certainly write a letter to the editor in response, or you can try to generate some new, local news around your own PE program, perhaps. If you go to the next slide. You can also engage at the local level. So certainly working at the state level and working with representatives is an important way of increasing political will at the state level. But we also have a theory of change where if you can work at the local level to increase the quality of PE, as well as engage your own local leaders, we can build a constituency across the state of people who are supportive of PE and ultimately who will put public demand on a better state PE policy. So if you are a PE teacher, you can speak with your children's parents about the importance of PE. Talk about the benefits you see in the children and the benefits other teachers might see in their classrooms because kids are in PE regularly. If you're a PE teacher, invite the community to your classes or even legislators to increase awareness of high quality PE. You can find others in your area interested in engaging and talk together to a school about their PE plan or policy. And ask your local districts about their PE policy and plan. Are they meeting current state requirements? Do they have a waiver? Are they exceeding state requirements? And find out more about what that is and ask them. And it is easier sometimes to go as a group to talk about these policy issues with your school leaders. You can attend your local school board meetings and advocate for stronger PE policies at the local level. And certainly we want to communicate about good PE successes in our local media and newsletters and blogs and in our community to really celebrate when good PE is occurring. And I think that raises awareness that, you know, a lot of people may think of PE, of the traditional PE of throwing dodgeballs at each other, rather than sort of the newer health-oriented and fitness-oriented type of PE we see today. And so communicating that may help change public opinion, which, as we mentioned earlier, can influence public policy. So at the next slide, I'm about to turn it over to our other guest. With us today is a guest speaker, Alan Madison. He's an attorney with, I can't remember all 49, Treister-Roche. You'll have to introduce yourself, Alan, with the full name of your firm. And he specializes in IRS rules around lobbying and non-lobbying for nonprofit and 501c3 organizations. So Alan, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you and take us through some of your information.
Thanks so much, Jana. I appreciate that. As Jana mentioned, I'm a lawyer that works with nonprofit organizations, largely in the public health world, but also in the environmental world and civil rights, helping organizations to understand, hey, how do we get policies changed? What can we do? What can't we do? There's all sorts of concern, legitimately so in some cases, but in some cases, overblown concern among nonprofits about what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. And so what we wanted to do on this webinar today was just take a few minutes to set expectations and address any concerns that organizations may have. The most important baseline rule is that Section 501c3 public charities, they can lobby. Now, private foundations generally can't conduct lobbying themselves, and they can't earmark their money for lobbying. So some of the grants that you receive may prohibit your organization from lobbying, but maybe not. Certainly money that you receive from individuals, from corporations, and from some sophisticated foundations may be allowed to be used for lobbying up to a certain limit. So the first most important thing is, as a C3, you're allowed to do lobbying. So the other question is, so what's lobbying? Well, there's two types of lobbying under the IRS rules. And the IRS rules are the rules that govern what a C3 may do as lobbying and what it can't do as lobbying. The first type of lobbying is direct lobbying. And these are just communications with legislators or with legislative staffers that reflect a view on legislation. So if you go to a meeting or you have a telephone call with a state senator, encouraging them to vote for legislation or thanking them for introducing legislation, that's going to be treated as direct lobbying. So you'd need to code your time and any affiliated expenses, for example, driving down to Springfield, you'd have to code that as direct lobbying. The other type of lobbying under the IRS rules is grassroots lobbying. And those are communications to the public as opposed to having a direct communication with a legislator. So these are communications to the public that reflect a view on legislation, and they have to include what the IRS defines as being a call to action. So a call to action in the biggest picture, in the biggest sense, is communications that nudge people into wanting to contact their legislator. So obviously, if you say, call Senator Durbin, that's going to be treated as a call to action. So if you say, call Senator Durbin and encourage him to pass S26 to keep our kids healthy, that's going to be grassroots lobbying. Or providing the legislator's phone number, or identifying the legislator as being neutral or opposed to your organization's position on the legislation. So for example, if you had a billboard on the I-90 that said, Senator Durbin, get off the fence and vote for S226, to keep our kids healthy. Now, you're not asking people to contact him, but because you're saying get off the fence, that might motivate people to pick up their phone and contact him. So the IRS has a broader definition of what's what's a call to action under grassroots lobbying, just so that we can't do an end run around leaving off the part of the communication that says call Senator Durbin. Let's go to the next slide, Sarah. So I was talking about the IRS rules. Illinois has a different set of rules related to lobbying, and they don't limit or prohibit you from lobbying. It's just a requirement that you register and file some reports. And the definitions under Illinois law differ slightly from the IRS rules. First of all, the Illinois rules cover both legislative action and executive action. And they also have a couple of different prongs to them. It doesn't require the call to action, and it involves whether or not you're making covered expenditures. If you make one of these triggering covered expenditures, then you'd have to file with the Illinois Secretary of State as a lobbyist. We're not going to get into the details of the Illinois requirements today. Sarah, if you can go to the next slide, because we don't want to we're not getting bogged down in this. The point today is to talk about what C3s can and cannot do within the IRS rules, within their tax-exempt status. So we talked about the IRS saying that it's grassroots lobbying if you have a communication to the public that talks about legislation and that urges people to contact their legislator or has a call to action. And we said that if you're doing direct lobbying, that's a communication with a legislator about specific legislation or a communication with a legislative staffer. So the more interesting part, since many of our grants are restricted and we have a limit on how much money we can spend on lobbying, more interesting than what's lobbying is to understand what isn't lobbying. What sort of activities can we do and not have them counted against our lobbying limits? Or what sort of activities can we do that can push for passage of a bill that can help us with advocacy, but that we can still use restricted grants from a foundation? So the first example is, just as Jana was talking about earlier, site visits. Bringing legislators out to a school and seeing, hey, what is this new modern PE all about? You know, today's PE isn't the PE that you grew up with or as a legislator. You know, these legislators who grew up in the 70s or early 80s, as Jana mentioned, they know from dodgeball and they know about being laughed at because they couldn't climb the rope all the way to the top of the school gymnasium. So it'd be really eye-opening for them to come and see what's modern PE. Now, if you set up that visit and you just are introducing them to modern PE but aren't talking about legislation, you're talking about the big policy issues but not referencing any specific legislation or asking them to introduce legislation, then that's not lobbying. Because remember, lobbying is only a communication with a legislator about legislation. So if you have a communication with a legislator that's on the bigger picture policy issue, that's a really important advocacy step that you can take. It's a really important part of the advocacy process is educating legislators about the vocabulary. What is it that we're talking about and why is it so important? If you think of it as a marathon, we can use non-lobbying dollars for the first 22 miles or so and save those lobbying dollars for the last 4.2 miles to get to the finish line. But having the legislators come to your school as a site visit, that's part of that, getting them to mile 22 using non-lobbying dollars. Let's go to the next slide here, Sarah. Another really important non-lobbying activity is building a list of supporters. So if we go back to the definition of grassroots lobbying in our head, grassroots lobbying were communications to the public that mention specific legislation and reflect a view on that legislation, and they include a call to action, meaning an IRS-defined call to action, urging people to contact their legislator. If you do a communication to the public that talks about legislation but doesn't have that call to action, then it's not lobbying. So for example, asking people to sign up for the IAPO email alert. You could send out, you can put up a website, you can put out blog postings, you can send out emails talking about a bill. And rather than telling people to contact their legislator, direct them to sign up for the IAPO email alert system. That way, the blog post or the other messages that you're sending out, or the time and expense related to an in-person visit, that's not going to be lobbying because you're not having a call to action. But later on, now that you've built that list of supporters, you can send messages to that list that say, hey, we know that you're a self-selecting group of people who care about PE in Illinois. There's an important bill, H214, and we need you to contact your legislator. Click here to find your legislator's phone number or email address and ask them to pass H214. That follow-up email to that self-selected list of supporters will count as lobbying, but none of the preparatory work of writing that blog post or creating that report would be lobbying. Let's go to the third slide here. So fact sheets about a bill aren't lobbying. This is a great example where we have an example of a fact sheet about a bill that you all created that wasn't lobbying because it was distributed broadly to the public, but it didn't have an IRS call to action. So this was a fact sheet that said, hey, we need to pass this bill that was introduced by Senator Holmes. It was distributed broadly to the public, to all the folks who are on this call, distributed out to journalists who cover education, who cover the legislative process in Springfield, given to bloggers who are interested in these topics, given to newspaper editorial boards to write editorials in support of SB 2572. All of that work is non-lobbying under the IRS rule because you're not asking people to contact these legislators. You're providing information about the bill without having a call to action on it. So this was a really effective use of non-lobbying, grant-funded, restricted dollars without having to treat it against your lobbying limits. And then a really important point on this that I really want to drive home, if you create these materials in advance and distribute them broadly to the public and to your allies and to organizations, that cost of creating the materials is not lobbying, and you can later on use these materials at lobby day. If you've got extras left over, distribute them in Springfield to legislators on lobby day, because the first use of it was for broad public education. Unfortunately, if you don't distribute these broadly to the public, then you later use them at lobby day, then using them in a lobbying context will turn the whole thing into a lobbying activity. So you really want to make sure you think strategically about the whole arc of your campaign so that you can create materials that will have a long shelf life. Let's go to the next slide. And this was just from the point that I wanted to make at the bottom of the fact sheet. It says, here's a list of folks who are supporting these bills so that we can build our coalition. And for more information, get involved by contacting Sarah, it said on this fact sheet. So rather than having a call to action of saying, call your legislator, the fact sheet said, get in touch with Sarah so that this doesn't have a call to action under the IRS rules. It stays as non-lobbying. And then, of course, these self-selecting people, when they contact Sarah, Sarah can follow up and make a lobbying ask of them. So thanks so much. I'm going to pass this back to Jana now. But thanks so much. And if you have questions, please shoot them over to Sarah and Jana, and we can address questions later on.
Great, thank you, Alan. And I'm going to hand it over to Sarah for the next section.
Thanks, Jana. So yes, so we have a reflection for you. Now we're going to move into messaging, messages for leaders, effective ones. So what messages resonate most with you? Feel free to go ahead and type in the chat box, and this could be...
And actually, I did see a couple questions for Alan. Alan, I don't know if you're still there or if you've hung up.
Nope, still here.
Oh, we did have one question. Someone asked, can they travel down to Springfield? Can they spend money to travel to Springfield to meet with their legislator? And I think that's probably in the context of if that's lobbying or not.
If they're going to be traveling to Springfield to meet with their legislator, the question is, will that meeting involve legislation? If they're going to Springfield and talking about PE as a general issue without addressing legislation, then that would not be lobbying. But if you're going to have time in Springfield with a legislator and talk about legislation, it's lobbying for IRS purposes. But that's a good thing. As I started the discussion, organizations do have the ability to do lobbying. A legislator's time is scarce and precious. So if you have the ability to talk to the legislator, it may be a really useful thing to use some of your lobbying dollars and pay for that time that you spent driving down to Springfield as a lobbying communication.
And I guess that's also only referring to people representing their organizations in those meetings, right? Not individuals as constituents.
That's right. If you are going in your individual capacity as a constituent, your organization's volunteers, if they go and there's no cost to your organization for them to go, your volunteers can go as much as possible. The time you spend organizing them to go, whether you're paying for their buses or whether you're just paying for a staff member to call them up and say, hey, we really hope you'll go down to Springfield next week to meet with Senator Smith. That staff time that's involved would count as lobbying.
Hi, Alan. Yeah, this is Alyssa. Just as a quick follow-up, because I was sort of wondering the same thing. I think the thing is that we have on this call both people who work for organizations whose organizations may or may not lobby and may or may not need to know, or do need to know, the distinctions so that they can lobby. But we also have individuals like PE teachers, or again, those organizations may be talking to individuals. So we just want to make sure that we're making the clarification that regular individuals responding to a grassroots call to action that says, go call your legislator, do not need to register to lobby, don't need to report any kind of expenses, and can meet with their legislators all they want. So if you want to organize a delegation to meet with a legislator, you as a staff person, if that's who we're talking to on this call, you as a staff person need to report your time getting that delegation together and the time meeting with the legislator. But all of those individuals in the delegation are not lobbyists. They are not registered, they don't have to register. They can go, they can spend the money to drive to Springfield, to do it in Springfield. And none of that is either a reportable lobbying cost for your organization, nor do they have any obligation to either register as lobbyists or report that. That's actually, just the First Amendment right to go talk to the government. So
that's a good,
clarify that.
That's a really good point, Alyssa. Yeah. Anyone who is just going in their own personal capacity, if they've, maybe an organization reached out to them to encourage them to go, or maybe their union encouraged them to go, or whatever it is, If you're just heading down to Springfield, or you're going to show up at a legislator's office in your district on your own time, that's totally fine. It's not part of any kind of registration. It's not treated as lobbying at all.
And likewise, if you're a PE teacher and you do that, there's nothing, you're not causing any kind of obligation on behalf of your school. If your school organizes you to go, then they would have to deal with that as a lobbyist, as a lobbying organization. But you doing it on your own time has no effect at all on your school. I guess I wouldn't do it during the middle of the hours that you're being paid for, paid to be at school, but on your lunch break or after hours. But you're not creating any, even if you work for somebody who has an interest in this issue, you're not creating any kind of lobbying impact in terms of the organization that you work for, unless that organization is the one that asked you to do the lobbying.
That's right.
Thank you, Alan. Okay, so with that, we'll move on. Again, thanks, Alan. That was great. So we wanted to move into talking a bit more about effective messaging. So someone asked for a clarification on this question. So before we talk about messages that have been identified as effective for different types of school leadership and people we want to reach, we're just wondering the messages that we've talked about that resonate with you. So you remember we talked about return on investment and the improved outcomes among students. So I did get some responses in prior to this, and feel free to keep typing if you want to tell us what resonates with you, but definitely that return on investment. Have a question if there's any evidence of a monetary amount with that return investment. Feel free to chime in, Alyssa, if you have anything to add, but the research we've seen is that the return on investment is the improvements in student outcomes, so their academic performance, their behavioral and health outcomes. So I don't know if you've seen anything that had a dollar amount to it, but it was that emphasis on the improved student outcomes. And then other things, the research and the empirical evidence. We definitely have more resources on our website, iphionline.org, that goes into more depth as far as the neuroscience that shows that connection between movement and improved student outcomes. And once again, the neuroscience being very compelling for people on this call. So with that, we'll talk a bit more about suggested messages about PE. So many of these messages came from the Enhanced PE Task Force, which part of their job was to come up with a plan to promote enhanced PE throughout the state. This task force was made up of representatives from all levels of school leadership and the school community. So they identified messages that they felt were resonant with these different school actors, basically. And so you can see the first set of bullets, the impact of physical education and physical activity on student outcomes. The improvement, especially in their academic performance, is definitely the most resonant with school leadership. The fact that being in physical education helped improve their grades and standardized test scores and their on-task behavior in the classroom. So those being among the strongest messages. And then for that, we have other reports that have come out. 2015 report showing that, again, kids that are active on a regular basis do better in math, reading, and writing. We would add, too, that with the Every Student Succeeds Act that is being implemented by states, it includes physical education as part of a child's well-rounded education. And this allows schools more access to funding for PE. And then for teachers, just emphasizing that high-quality daily PE doesn't necessarily require a lot of resources or equipment. It can be achieved with careful creative scheduling, with small tweaks to the way games and activities are managed and the classroom is managed, and little to no equipment, things like small-sided games. So practice time. We would love to hear from you in the chat box, reflections to questions I'm about to put up here. So let me just put them up. So what would you say if you had the question, can't we just have recess instead of PE to get kids moving? Go ahead and type in the chat box what you might say to that question. Question box, so I can see your incoming responses. Do kids need Do kids learn to read by sitting in the library? You can see I tied earlier my definition of physical education to how books are a vehicle to learning to read, so that's interesting. Not structured, not standards-based, not assessed as far as recess. Exactly, that is what I would say in response to this, which is, as we talked about in that earlier slide, physical activity and what you do in recess is not the same as physical education. We're having structured, developmentally appropriate curriculum that's about skill development and fitness for life. So good answers there. Second question that you might hear from legislator or from anybody who's thinking about this: how is a minutes per week requirement better than 3 days per week? What might you say to that? And while you're thinking about that response, we had one other response come from the previous question. Physical education is the hub of a comprehensive school physical activity program, and without skill development of quality PE does not transcend. Without skill development that comes through quality PE, that would not transcend to good quality active schools.
You wouldn't really have a good comprehensive school physical activity program, because the foundation for that, even in recess and in the work that's done in the classroom or after school, is the PE thing. So the rest of the recess and all of that is better and better for kids if it's built on the foundation of PE.
So with the minutes per week question, thank you. The answer that we might give is to say the minutes per week requirement, and a minutes per week is the CDC shape recommendation for how much physical education is recommended to be provided for students. And of course, a component of that is making sure they get the recommended amount of physical activity, PE being a key opportunity for that. And the minutes per week would give schools and districts that flexibility to schedule it in a way that works for them, while still ensuring that students are getting the recommended amount. And to add on to that, we have a response. National recommendations are based on health outcomes. All right, so question 3. What should schools do when they don't have the facilities or time to meet these requirements? Let us know what you might say to that. Give you a second to type that in. So one thing we might say in response to that, as we talked about in the last slide, is that actually high quality enhanced PE doesn't necessarily require a lot of resources or fancy facilities. So we've definitely done webinars, and you can check those out on iphionline.org, where we are discussing things like creative scheduling to make use of existing facilities, things like equipment sharing programs, things like small tweaks to classroom management and activities to allow for maximum amount of movement time. And we have a response here along those lines: be creative in looking for ways to support your physical educators so they have the space, equipment, and resources they need to deliver standards-based curriculum and instruction. All right, thanks for your responses on that. With that, we will move into any questions you might have. Feel free to go ahead and type those into the chat box. I'll give you about a few more seconds to type in any questions you may want to run by us. All right, if there are no questions, then we thank you for joining us. Well, let's see here, maybe we have one in. Hold on, I think we might have a question coming in. How have you worked with school administrators, superintendents and such to get them on board as well? Great question. So as we mentioned with the enhanced PE work here in Illinois and the work that the Illinois Public Health Institute is doing, it's definitely about Hearts and Minds campaign, a component to really educate and explain, especially at that leadership level, since they're in such a position to set priorities for the school, allocate resources, determine priorities. So really important to get them on board. So some of the messages that were identified by the Enhanced PE Task Force, we definitely use and reiterate in every single one of our presentations. So as we mentioned, emphasizing the improved student outcomes for students, especially the academic outcomes, is by far, and we hear it again and again, the most compelling messaging to administrators. So we use those different things. We had resources. So we use our enhanced PE fact sheet. We have a slide showing brain activity that we use in every single presentation that really is a strong visual of the impact that physical activity has on brain function. So we basically make use of those fact sheets, emphasize our messages again and again, and use those visuals that we know are so effective to really just explaining that return on investment and the benefits you see to students. So I would say that that's the number one way. And we definitely make a point to try and get these messages out and do presentations and get in front of this audience, because we have found, and we have worked with administrators and superintendents who, once they learned of the neuroscience and the research, really came to be champions of enhanced PE. And we also, when those champions that we do have, we encourage them and enlist them to also speak to their peers. Hearing it from a peer and a colleague is another way to just really get people to listen. So that's what I'd say. Anything to add, but. All right, and then yes, so I had someone else with a response. Have administrators, exactly, talk to other administrators who get it completely. All right, so with that.
There's another question. Is there any way we can strategically?
Any way we can strategically explore how schools are not only aware of the policy, but adhering to these policies?
So this is really one of the challenges. There's one of the challenges in Illinois is that we have 800 plus school districts, and it's a very, very decentralized system. So there are some minimal checks up on a range of requirements in the school code that the State Board of Education does, but there really isn't a good source of data collection. We're not even sure that there's a good source of who has waivers and what those waivers are for or how they're using those waivers. On the other hand, a couple of the other advances that have happened in the last few years have been some required reporting around PE on the school report card. So each individual school and each individual school district are required to report, is it minutes per week or days per week? Sarah, do you remember on the school report card?
I think it's days per week.
Days per week. So I believe that each individual school, I don't know where that's compiled. So it would be sort of a research project to go through every school report card to try to collect what is reported about PE on the school report card. And then there's also the school report card is required to report on the results of the fitness testing. So there's a certain amount of that fitness testing data that are required to be submitted to the Illinois State Board of Education. I think it's in 3rd, 7th, and 10th grade or something like that. So there is 5th, 7th, and
10th grade.
5th, 7th, and 10th grade. Sorry, not 3rd. So as there's only 1 year of data on that now. I mean, we're sort of only into the 2nd year of the fitness testing law, but that will provide not information about policy, which is really what your question asked, and I recognize that, but we should be able to over time have a source of somewhat validated valid surveillance data about fitness and the state of fitness, and you can look at your own school and see whether your kids are meeting fitness standards or not. And then we should be able to also look at aggregate fitness. And so over time, we should be able to talk about gaps in whether kids are fit based on some of that fitness data. Now, that also requires that the fitness tests are being administered exactly correctly and the data are being reported correctly. But if there were ever research dollars, that would be a really interesting research project to dig into some of the fitness data that's reported.
Thank you. And I'll just read the final comment that came in, which is just that encouraging teachers to actually read the state codes and regulations around PE, and I'd add, even reading the laws, or I guess it would now be written into school code around things like the fitness testing can just be really good kind of ammunition or facts that can help make cases about, what's around these PE requirements.
Right. I mean, I think that that's right also, in that you could talk about reading the actual and communicating with, I think one of the things that principals and administrators and so on don't actually really know, even teachers don't always know, is that there are standards for PE. And so part of making the case for resources for PE and paying attention to PE is that your students are supposed to be meeting certain standards at certain grade levels, and educating about the fact that there are underlying standards and what those are and why the standards make a difference in children's lives, and therefore we need to invest in meeting the standards just like we would invest in kids meeting reading standards and math standards is another piece of, I think, education as well for administrators to understand that you're trying, as a PE teacher, trying to meet your kids meet certain standards.
Thank you. All right, with that, I think that's good closing comments. So thank you for joining us. We will send out a link to this, recording, and there is a copy of the slides in your handout section, and there will be an evaluation popping up at the end of this automatically when I close it out. We'd love to hear from you, your thoughts on this webinar, so we can always improve our offerings. So thank you once again for joining us, and have a good rest of your day.